Thanks for joining us today to talk about how we can advance the equitable inclusion of refugees by understanding and responsibly addressing the needs of students with and seeking refugee protection. So I just want to thank you for your interest and your commitment to supporting this group of students. And it is through our shared commitment and our collective work in collaboration with children and families with and seeking refugee protection that we can strengthen education systems and progress towards inclusive and equitable quality education for every student and all groups of students. So our colloquium today is based on a study that I conducted in collaboration with Dr. Peter Milley, who so graciously introduced me. It draws on research supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And our study was published in the Canadian Journal of Educational Administration and Policy earlier this year. So before we begin, I would like to make a note about terminology. I recognize that there are a range of terms used to refer to this group of students, and I have chosen to use the term students with and seeking refugee protection. So students with refugee protection have been determined to be refugees and granted rights and protection in Canada. Students seeking refugee protection are asylum seekers in Canada. They say that they are refugees, but the Canadian government or the United Nations has not yet determined whether they are refugees. I have chosen these terms for 4 reasons. So first, it is student-centered. Second, it emphasizes refugee protection. So on top of all of the protections and rights that all children have, this group of children has a right to a special type of protection and help that's called refugee protection. And it does 4 different things. So it ensures that their rights are protected. It prevents the person from being hurt, abused, or treated badly. It ensures that the person is protected from any harms. And lastly, it ensures that the person lives in dignity. So refugees have more protection than asylum seekers, but asylum seekers have some of this protection because they may be later determined to be refugees. So the third reason why I chose the term was because it reflects how Canada's refugee system works. So Canada's refugee system has 2 parts, and there's one part for people who are seeking protection within Canada. And then there's a second part for people who are outside of Canada and asking for protection. And then fourth, it's active. It reminds us that these students have an active right to protection in Canada and can actively exercise their rights. It also reminds us that we have a responsibility and an active role to play in ensuring their protection. And as you obviously guessed from the presentation title, students with and seeking refugee protection are an equity-deserving group. So equity in education involves providing fair opportunities to learn and supporting the full development of every student and all groups of students. Data-informed decision-making is increasingly seen as a way of advancing equity in education. The idea is that data can be used to inform continuous improvement, confirm assumptions, challenge assumptions, and to track student progress. However, the most marginalized groups tend to be invisible in education data at global, national, and regional levels. There's a particularly big gap when it comes to students with and seeking refugee protection. And one of the reasons for this is that there's limited data on people with and seeking refugee protection in general, let alone data specifically on their education. Another reason is that education data can rarely be disaggregated by refugee claimant or refugee status to show which education data pertains to students with and seeking refugee protection. So currently, there is limited data on the education of students with and seeking refugee protection. The data that do exist tend to be fragmented, and they relate mainly to education access and enrollment, but even here there are gaps. Data on other aspects of their education, like learning outcomes, education quality, and data about the learning environment are scarce and tend to be anecdotal. So you might be asking yourself, why is there this data gap when it comes to this group of students? So part of the reason is who this group is. So refugees are people who fear being persecuted because of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And in terms of membership in a particular social group, this can be groups that are defined by things like gender, sexual orientation, or HIV status. Refugees are also people who are at risk of torture or cruel or unusual punishment in their country of origin. So people with these experiences are justifiably reluctant or unwilling in many cases to have their personal data collected and used. And another reason why there's limited data on this group of students is related to the way that the United Nations, governments, and humanitarian organizations have managed this group's education and their data. So in 1985, UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency, began supporting the access of all students with and seeking refugee protection to primary education. And at that time, UNHCR and governments favored the use of refugee camps to provide shelter and services to forcibly displaced persons. And this led to education mainly being provided for students with and seeking refugee protection by humanitarian organizations in refugee camps. But then in the early 2000s, UNHCR changed its policy to support the residents of forcibly displaced persons in urban areas instead of refugee camps, and to provide alternatives to camps. And this prompted a change in global refugee education policy to promote the inclusion of students with and seeking refugee protection in national education systems. And that happened in 2012. But even though this shift aimed to shift the responsibility for the education of this group of students from humanitarian organizations to governments, there was not a shift in the management of their data. So it tends to be that education data on this group of students is mainly managed by humanitarian organizations and is largely unavailable from government-managed education systems. So currently, the global policy that is guiding the education of this group of students is called Refugee Education 2030, and it's from the United Nations Refugee Agency. And it sets a vision for the equitable quality education of this group of students in national education systems. But with data on the educational needs of this group of students lacking at multiple levels, it's difficult for governments to accommodate the needs of this group of students and to include them equitably in national education systems. So that's the context, and let's dive into the study a bit more. So today's colloquium is based on an assessment of the needs of students with and seeking refugee protection in primary and secondary education in Canada. And it addressed three different questions. So first, what areas of needs of students with and seeking refugee protection are inherent in UNHCR's Refugee Education 2030 strategy as the global reference point for their equitable inclusion? Second, how are these areas of need described and explained in empirical studies in the research literature? And third, to what extent do students with and seeking refugee protection across Canada have these needs? And we chose to focus on Canada for three reasons. So first, about 20% of all refugees who were resettled globally for a decade, so 2010 to 2020, were resettled to Canada. Second, Canada is pretty unique in that Canada's 13 education systems have a longstanding practice of including students with and seeking refugee protection. And by the 13 education systems, I mean the 10 provinces and the 3 territories that have responsibility for education in Canada. And then third, the Canadian federal government, who is the one responsible for determining whether people are refugees and which refugees to allow in Canada, made all of the data that it collected on these types of decisions public as of January 2015. So this open data made it possible for us to assess the needs of students with and seeking refugee protection, and that's what Peter and I did through this study. And to our knowledge, this is the first public study to systematically assess the needs of students with and seeking refugee protection across a country using government data. So a bit more about the nerdy things, the methods. So there were 3 different phases and 3 methods. In the first phase, we collected data from credible authorities. So using UNHCR's Refugee Education 2030 strategy as a starting point, because UNHCR is considered a global expert in protecting the rights of forcibly displaced persons, including their right to education. So to identify the needs of this group of students, we focused on a section in the UNHCR policy text that articulates an equity aim. So there's this part that's about supporting learning for all students, and it enumerates the different types of supports with which this group of students should be provided. And we inferred 5 different areas of need from this list. Then in the second phase, we did a literature review that was focused on research studies related to those 5 areas of needs that we identified in phase 1. So we did this by trying to describe the 5 different areas of need. We used a search strategy that combined the term refugee and terms related to each of those 5 areas of need. And then we searched for databases, so ERIC, Education Source, PsycInfo, and LearnTechLib. Then we included and excluded text based on eligibility criteria. And then ultimately, we coded the final sample of articles in vivo qualitative analysis software, and we were looking at the different areas of need, again, through that coding. And then in the third phase, we assess the extent to which these needs are present among students with and seeking refugee protection across Canada. And we did this by identifying, reviewing, and synthesizing public data related to the 4 areas of need. So we took this data from government, international organizations, and academic databases. So we were really interested in data covering the period of January 2015 to March 2020. And we were looking at Open Government Canada, the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNESCO, the United Nations Institute for Statistics, and the World Bank. But then there was one area of need where we couldn't find data sets that were published in the last 5 years. So we conducted a literature search for meta-analyses and systematic reviews to get some data on this area of need. So what did we find? So what are the needs of students with and seeking refugee protection? So from Refugee Education 2030, we identified 5 areas of need for students with and seeking refugee protection to be equitably included in primary and secondary education system. So these are access to education, accelerated education, language education, mental health and psychosocial support, and special education. So that's phase 1. For phase 2, we were looking at how can these needs be described and explained. So let's start with access to education. The global averages of primary, secondary, and post-secondary education access among this group of students are 63%, 24%, and 3% for primary, secondary, and post-secondary, respectively. So this means that 27% don't have access to primary education, 76% do not have access to secondary, and 97% do not have access to post-secondary. Their education access rates differ across countries, but globally there are a range of barriers that are preventing their education access. So these can be systemic barriers like a lack of documentation required for enrollment, like birth certificates or transcripts, a lack of recognition of prior education. In many countries, they also face school-level barriers such as poor infrastructure, large class sizes, and having to travel far distances to schools. They commonly face contextual barriers like a lack of opportunities after graduation, early pregnancy or marriage, bullying, discrimination, and gender-based violence. Many also face financial barriers and need to contribute to their household by working or caring for siblings instead of attending school. As for accelerated education, most students with and seeking refugee protection need accelerated learning when they gain access to formal education. So they can benefit from accelerated education programs. They condense a curriculum while developing foundational literacy and mathematics knowledge and skills so that students can complete their learning in that short accelerated time frame. Some of the reasons for this need is that many experience interruptions in their access to education, inadequate quality of formal education, and differences between the curricula and languages used in the different places where they attended school during their refugee journeys. This group spends a disproportionate amount of time learning new languages of instruction, and oftentimes that's at the expense of learning the curriculum. And often the amount of time that they can spend in school is restricted with age policies. So the third area of need is language education. It is common for the languages that students with and seeking refugee protection are learning and using at school and in the community to change. In their country of origin, the language of instruction is often different than the language that they speak at home or in their community. So even before they were displaced, many students had to learn the language of instruction in their country of origin. And then when they're displaced to that other country, many students need to learn the language that's used in that education system. And this language may be different from the languages that are commonly spoken in the community. So students may have to learn the language of instruction, and the community language to develop social relations with community members. And then some of those students then move to another country or are resettled. And in those countries, they often have to learn one or more languages, again, for the education system and for the community. And throughout all these different transitions, many students are striving to maintain their proficiency in all these different languages. So these complicated language learning scenarios prompt Reddick and Dryden-Peterson to argue that schools and education systems should use a plurilingualism approach to language education that supports students to use all the languages that they wish to use alongside the language of instruction. But we know that in many countries, language education uses a subtractive approach where students learn the language of instruction to the detriment or the loss of other languages that they may know. So this can lead to students feeling marginalized or disconnected from their families and communities. And then in terms of language education approaches, they're often inappropriate or inadequate, where students may not have enough time for language education, there may not be enough resources, they're placed in a separate classroom until they learn the language, and then they can integrate mainstream classes. So when students then integrate the classroom, they may experience stigma, stereotyping, or inequitable treatment in those mainstream classes. The fourth area of need that we identified was mental health and psychosocial support. So students with and seeking refugee protection have higher rates of mental health concerns than their peers who have not been forced to flee. The literature notes that this is especially depression, anxiety, and trauma and stressor-related disorders. The literature also says that schools are well positioned to support the mental health and well-being of this group of students because schools are one of the main public institutions that this group tends to have access to. And there are also a range of mental health supports that can be offered in schools to address the range of different needs that students may have. And then the fifth area of need is special education. So we're using the term special education instead of inclusive education because we're talking about like inclusion of refugees in education, and the terms are quite similar, so it's a bit confusing. So special education, the literature says that there's little data or information about neurodiversity and corresponding special education needs among this group of students. However, most students in this group are coming from low and middle income countries where some neurodevelopmental disorders are more prevalent than in high income countries. So students with and seeking refugee protection may be more likely to have special education needs than their peers who have been living in high income countries and never been forcibly displaced. It can be hard, though, to identify special education needs among this group of students, and the literature unpacks four different potential reasons. So the first being that assessments commonly use age-based development benchmarks, and the birth dates of some of these children are incorrectly documented, especially if they're born during a refugee journey. Second, assessment tools can be linguistically and culturally inappropriate for the range of cultural and linguistic backgrounds of students with and seeking refugee protection. And the third reason is that indicators of special education needs can look similar to language learning and accelerated education needs. And the fourth is that students may have multiple co-occurring needs, and this can mean that they identify one need and they assume that it's the reason for all the needs that the child is having. All right, so let's talk about what this means in Canada. So to what extent do students with and seeking refugee protection across Canadian education systems experience these needs? During this phase, the third phase, we were estimating the prevalence rates. And we expect that all 5 areas of need will be present among this group of students who arrived in Canada between January 2015 and March 2020. But the prevalence of these needs likely varies across Canada because of the different distribution of students with and seeking refugee protection across the different provinces and territories. So let's talk about access to education first. So more than 130,000 students with and seeking refugee protection arrived in Canada between January 2015 and March 2020. And there were nearly equal numbers of the two different subgroups, so students with refugee protection and students seeking refugee protection. And all of these students need access to education. All 13 of Canada's educational jurisdictions have a responsibility for ensuring the education access of some students within seeking refugee protection. But like I said, the distribution of the population varies dramatically. So there are students from these groups across all of the provinces and territories, but 46% of students with refugee protection are in Ontario and 44% are in Quebec. Sorry, that was students seeking refugee protection. They're mainly in Ontario and in Quebec. And then for students with refugee protection, they're in all 10 provinces and 2 of the 3 territories. So students seeking refugee protection are mainly in Ontario, with about 41% being there. But there are also large numbers in Quebec, with about 18%, and Alberta with 14%. So what this means is that the education systems in Ontario and Quebec are the ones that are mainly responsible for responding to the needs of most students within seeking refugee protection, because in total, about 74% of this full group resides in those provinces during the period covered by this study. In contrast, the education systems in the 4 Western provinces, so British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, are responsible for about 22%. Those in the maritime provinces, so Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and Prince Edward Island, are responsible for just about 4%. And then the territories, which are Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and the Yukon, are responsible for less than 0.03% of this population. All right, so let's talk about accelerated education. Nearly all students within seeking refugee protection in Canada need accelerated education due to previously experiencing no, interrupted, or low quality formal education. Most students seeking refugee protection need accelerated education, but they are more likely to have had access to a higher quality education than students with refugee protection before coming to Canada. So let's unpack that a little bit more. What we saw is that approximately 21% of students with refugee protection had no formal education before arriving in Canada, with rates varying by jurisdiction. On average, each student misses about 3 to 4 years of schooling before coming to Canada. And then the education that many students did have access to before arriving in Canada may have been not conducive to the development of minimum levels of proficiency in mathematics and literacy. So approximately 82% of students with refugee protection and 23% of students seeking refugee protection were from countries that were classified by the World Bank as low income in 2020. And when we used that in combination with data from the United Nations Institute for Statistics, we saw that the countries that most of the students were coming from were noted to have issues with literacy and mathematics education. All right, so language education. Approximately 2 in 3 students with and seeking refugee protection in Canada need to learn the language of instruction. So in Canada, the languages of instruction are most commonly one or both of the official languages of English and French. But in the 4 Western provinces, they have legalized languages other than English and French as the languages of instruction for public education. And then Inuktitut, at the time of the study, was being phased in as the language of instruction in Nunavut. Approximately 61% of students with refugee protection did not speak English or French when they arrived in Canada. So that means that most students likely needed to learn at least one of the languages of instruction. And again, the rates varied by the jurisdiction. But many of these students were plurilingual. So although just over 2% of the students with refugee protection spoke English or French as their first language when they arrived in Canada, approximately 39% spoke English and or French when they arrived. And at least 56 other languages were spoken by this group of students in total. As for mental health and psychosocial support, we'll start with psychosocial support. And we would suggest that all students within seeking refugee protection could benefit from psychosocial support, because like all children, they are developing socially and emotionally, and like all children, they should be supported in this development. Their particular experiences and circumstances can often warrant more targeted psychosocial support. Some of the literature that we were looking at suggested that all refugees experience social trauma, and that social trauma has multifaceted and long-lasting effects. So these students could benefit from trauma-informed supports. Also, as newcomers to Canada, they may be experiencing acculturation and should be provided with acculturation supports. And many are also experiencing discrimination in Canada based on religion, race, or legal status, even though this is prohibited in Canada, and they may require support in coping with these experiences of discrimination. Many students also need support for specific mental health concerns. There's a higher prevalence of many different mental health concerns among this group of students compared to their peers who have not been forcibly displaced. And the most common are trauma and stressor-related disorders, with about 23% of the children experiencing these. 16% have depression, and 14% have anxiety, according to a recent meta-analysis. And lastly, at least 15% of these students need special education. And this is because 15% of people who are forcibly displaced have disabilities. Additionally, through our data analysis, we estimated that nearly 16,000 students with and seeking refugee protection have serious health conditions or disabilities when they arrived in Canada between January 2015 and March 2020. And this includes 1,200 students who were resettled specifically through the government sponsorship pathway because of the severity of their medical needs. And unfortunately, we could not find any data on the prevalence of giftedness among this group of students, although, it's surely there, there's just not the data. So you may be asking yourself, now what? How do we use these findings to responsibly support students with and seeking refugee protection in Canadian education systems? So for this group of students to be equitably included in Canadian education systems, they need to, first of all, be able to access education and then receive an education that is responsive to their particular needs, strengths, and circumstances. So just to preface, we should all recognize that the volumes of students coming to Canada and their distribution patterns across the country may change in the future, and that this study is based on 5 years worth of data. But based on this assessment over 5 fairly recent years, it's a reasonable observation that those of us who are in Ontario and Quebec have the largest stake in ensuring educational equity for this group of students, and the Western provinces also have a pressing role to play. But like we said at the very outset, equity is founded on a commitment to meaningfully differentiating education for each individual student and for all groups of students. So we shouldn't let, a number or the percentage that they represent affect our commitment to supporting each child. So all students with and seeking refugee protection in every Canadian education system should be supported regardless of their number in a system. So if you're a teacher, first of all, I want to start off by thanking you for all your work that you do to support all the students in your classes and schools, including students with and seeking refugee protection. And I want to emphasize 2 key takeaways for you. So I would suggest to use these 5 common areas of need as a starting point when working with students who are seeking or granted refugee protection. So I have often heard it's hard to know where to start. So these 5 areas of need can be something that you take away and you think about when you're interacting with students. But obviously, I want to be clear that not all students in this group will have these areas of need. So that's the second takeaway. It's important to recognize the diversity across and within this group of students with and seeking refugee protection, including with respect to these 5 areas of need. So one student might have language education and accelerated education needs, while another might have special education needs. And 2 students who have the same needs might have different specific types of needs within this broad area of need. So, for example, a student with special education needs might have a visual impairment or a learning disability, and that obviously will require a different type of support. They might also have different levels of each specific need. So an example of this would be, students who have different levels of literacy in the Latin alphabet will be provided with different types of language education support based on their literacy level. So those are the 2 key takeaways for teachers. Then for policymakers, I also have, 3 recommendations. So again, use these 5 common areas of need as a starting point. Peter and I also did a different study that was looking at policy that was responding to these different needs. And I would just, say to go back to that and look at the policy and check for these 5 areas of needs and that there is support for these 5 common areas. The other thing would be, similarly to teachers, to recognize the diversity across and within this group of students. And I wanted to highlight really the differences and the similarities between students with refugee protection and students seeking refugee protection. It's really common to combine these 2 groups into this one cohort or into this broader group of students from refugee backgrounds that often includes, people whose family came to Canada as refugees, even if the child doesn't have that direct experience. This big group of students have these needs that may differentiate them from other populations in schooling systems or in education systems. But I really want to highlight that students seeking refugee protection may have more precarious relationships with public institutions and to the resources that are available, through education or through other public services. Just keeping those 2 distinctions in mind and the considerations about legal status and how they may affect what a child can access or be entitled to. And the third takeaway is to prioritize work on accelerated education, especially in Ontario. So like I said, most students with and seeking refugee protection have accelerated education needs, but the prior study that Peter, Dr. Eliane Delude, and I conducted showed that education policies addressing missed education or interrupted education among this group of students are largely incoherent, and that this may adversely affect the implementation of these policies and the provision of supports in this area. And I emphasize Ontario here because this was especially the case with policies in Ontario, but Ontario is where nearly 43% of students with and seeking refugee protection across Canada live. So it should be a high priority. All right, and then for us researchers and evaluators who are here today, I have 3 takeaways as well. So the first is to assess the strengths and capabilities of students with and seeking refugee protection. Our study was focused on the needs of students rather than their many capabilities and strengths, because this study was part of a larger, multifaceted study that was examining education policy, addressing these areas of needs for this group of students. And when we were looking at it from a policy lens, we know that policy is often developed in response to perceived needs and ways of addressing them. So we really wanted to zero in on the needs and that link to policy. But obviously, it's really important to take a strengths-based approach and to understand and build on the prior learnings, capabilities, and strengths of this group. So we would recommend that future research, could take a similar approach in terms of methods in, collecting data, organizing it, analyzing it to give a more holistic picture about these strengths that may be related to the needs or they may be something else. The second takeaway is that researchers could update this work, perhaps on a 5-year cycle using the data sources included here, with the hope of countering any, homogenizing discourses, because this was really focused on one, cohort of students during a specific 5-year span. But, in the future, there will be different groups. So we want to make sure that everyone has the most up-to-date data. And lastly, really emphasizing that accelerated education piece, I would recommend that research and evaluation be undertaken on accelerated education. So how should, education systems be responding to the accelerated education needs of this group of students? So that's it. Again, I just want to close by thanking you all so much for your interest and your commitment in, advancing the equitable inclusion of this group of students. And I'm hoping that this was helpful for you today.